Well, it's all you.
Okay. Can you hear me first, Trevor?
Yes. Can we check? I can hear you.
Everybody else can you see the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. So we, as a group, a yellow team, discussed the implementation of artificial intelligence within the state-funded schools. And I do forgive me if this does sound like science fiction. Please entertain this, because if it doesn't sound like science fiction, then I don't think we're doing AI justice in any shape or form. Now, when we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about it being the fourth industrial revolution that will, and I do emphasize that word there, transform all of our jobs and lives over the next decade or so. But it's important to note that this is not a new concept. What is enabling this revolution today is not the computers or the ed tech that we're seeing around us, but it's the evolution of this machine learning systems that are around us today. And education as a sector is, to some extent, flagging behind other sectors across the globe. And, you know, as leaders, we are looking to kind of develop that and to develop that as we go forward into the 21st century. You know, these machines aren't just capturing the explicit knowledge. You know, they are using huge amounts of data, big data, to develop that tactic knowledge, the intuitive know-how that's embedded within the human mind. Now, when it comes to considering artificial intelligence and the strategy in which we would employ within our state-funded schools, you know, we would turn to Ansoff, you know, the father of strategic management, and just look at his insights that the key to strategy is recognizing that if a company is functioning, then it is part of the environment itself. And the good strategic manager would realize that the environment is constantly in flux, the open system constantly changing. And once the strategic leader were to take that mindset, then they can prepare and best prepare for any future that may put toward them. And we know that AI is going to play a key role in shaping educational practices. We just don't know what that might look like within the next decade or so. Now, as such, we must consider the potential benefits that, as future leaders, we would gain from the adoption of AI within the sector. And there are two main areas that we would review here. First of all, and this is the focus for our presentation today, is to improve education processes, both in the classroom and at the system level. And we can speak for hours about this in itself. The second area, which we will allude to at the end of the presentation, is preparing students for the new skill sets of the increasingly automated economies and societies that they ultimately will be growing into. Looking at that first point, though, artificial intelligence in secondary education, there are multiple benefits, and I'm just going to outline some of those here for you now as our group discussed over the past few weeks. You know, in most cases, AI applications are still very nascent, and they are used in experimental and local contexts rather than at huge scale within the system. But that said, doesn't mean it's not going to just, you know, turn overnight and suddenly we're going to be using AI. It's going to be something that filters into the system, whether we realize it or not. You know, and there are multiple examples of promising uses that might foreshadow how artificial intelligence is going to transform education within the next decades. In summary, though, you know, successful AI applications that we might consider successful in the education sector would be use of AI to assess skill sets, using AI to increase the personalization of learning, the use of AI to support students with special needs, to reduce the dropout rate, especially in those latter years and those years going on into years 12 and 13. But also, you know, using AI to automate systems management. And I think this is quite an important point, because if you can automate certain systems within the school, you free up capital and free up resource that can be reinvested and perpetuate, you know, and have potentially more money from the state to invest into further AI. So you almost create this hyper learning environment that pupils will access AI to begin with, and before you know it, it will transcend. Just think, last year, you know, would we be sitting here presenting online through virtual meetings? It just seems to have happened, and it just seems so normal to us now. AI could possibly occur in this fashion. Now, when we are looking at, you know, the assessment, I mean, going back to that previous slide, points 1 and 2 are going to be our focus for the implementation of AI within our classrooms, especially in terms of the assessment of skills. Now, there is this shift at the moment within education where, you know, assessments are designed to test the application of skills rather than that acquisition of knowledge. And AI offers this way of assessing more complex skills and complex problem solving. And, once we start to see this embedded within assessment, we're going to find the possibility for moment-to-moment assessments in digital learning environments where the AI systems will be able to determine whether or not our students have mastered particular skill sets and whether they can store information, where they will store information about our students, this big data, to give formative and elaborated feedback. But also the potential for game-based assessment or game-based learning. Just imagine one of your students or a class taking a trip in a virtual reality intestine of the teacher themselves, looking at the innards of the human body. That's just one potential use of AI within the classroom. But then we also consider this notion of personalization of learning. One of the key parts of the assessment is how you then use it to personalize the learning within the classroom. We could identify pedagogical materials, we can adapt approaches for each individual student, we can make informative predictions, recommendations, decisions based on the data that is collected on these particular students. And we see this already in Hagati maths and Bedrock vocabulary, but more importantly, in recent successes of the use of AI in education in the Indian section is the Baiju Learning app, where we've had students in grades 6 to 12 and 4 to 5 making use of AI, which combines instruction with diagnosis and personalization to push each individual student further and further within their learning. And we're going to come back to that notion in a second when we talk about the implication of our vision of what it might look like in the state-funded schools. In this sense, we discussed the AI tool. If we were to have this tool at our disposal, what would the aims be in terms of the tool? Now, we've got 4 aims here, which was to reduce teacher workload, to improve assessment of student learning, to provide differentiated tasks, and to increase student autonomy. And in doing so, we are going back to that notion of assessment of the student learning in the classroom. We know that the current system of assessment is outdated, and AI could potentially, this envisioned platform could be trained to assess and build that personalized curriculum for each student, with the aim of developing the mastery of skills and or knowledge, the ability to understand the abstract concepts within the classroom, and to problem solve. But I just really want to point out to you here that this isn't a case where there is this great fear of robotics taking over and the teacher will become artificial intelligence. Instead, we discussed how actually there needs to be extensive data management of these systems, because you would have to use that data to train artificial intelligence within the classroom to be able to read and to be able to take note of those assessments. In our case, we discussed potentially this AI tool that could read student handwriting and make judgments of work that's being produced in the classroom. And this will allow the AI to assess and grade student work by comparing it to a mark scheme that would have been inputted by the teacher into that system. When we think of AI in the classroom, think of it as, assisted learning. Think of AI as the teaching assistant of the 21st century. And when you think about the adoption rates of AI in the classroom, just think those big tech companies, those AI companies, they are going to favor this notion of they're going to favor this notion of buy-in and adoption over revenue. They want as many schools taking this on board as possible. And if that is the case, it might be in the future that instead of looking at our phones and saying, hey Siri or hi Cortana, could you search this for me? It might be, oh, hi Newton, could you just review that equation for Jonathan over there? Or it might be, Chaucer, can you just review these 3 essays just to check on the mark scheme here? But the notion is that it is going to be this partnership between teacher and AI, and that's the important step that we need to take. And that's where implementation comes in. And we know through Jacobs that 70% of organizational change can be reported as unsuccessful. And it is crucial that we understand how we implement change processes inside of the sector, so that we can do this as leaders as efficiently as possible. And we've already heard of Fulham once already for today, but with Fulham's drivers, it's important that do the drivers foster intrinsic motivation of teachers and students? Do the drivers support continuous improvement? Do the drivers encourage collective endeavors or teamwork? Do the drivers affect all teachers and students? And once we have those drivers and those questions answered, we can then consider the model of implementation. And we discussed as a group that Kotter's 8-step model is a way forward that we could possibly enact positive change within our state-funded school. Creating that urgency, forming the powerful coalition, creating a vision for change. And you need this to come from your strategic leaders, so then it can be communicated and engaged with within the teaching community, and to be, to build on it and to manage and to see that it is a successful change. Because if it is not managed successfully, you might find that this train of progress that pulls into the station of the 21st century will just fast track by the state-funded schools and leave us working at a disadvantage, especially when we consider the education systems globally. You might find that other education systems in different countries, on different continents, might adapt and adopt AI far quicker, which would put them at a greater advantage. But when it comes to the implementation, we discussed the barriers that might be in the way that would hold people back from boarding that train of progress. And we have cultural barriers where there might be this reluctance to relinquish pedagogical control from our professionals within the sector. There is this fear that teachers would no longer be regarded as experts, a lack of interpersonal interaction, as AI cannot and does not and will not perhaps understand group activities and discussions. There is time, which could be a barrier. It will take time to implement the strategy, and it does take time to consider and to research and to understand. But there could also be a shortage of talent, a lack of strategic approach, and of course the technical issues in which we would usually find with EdTech, for example. But all of these things are barriers that need to be taken seriously if us as leaders today are to see that AI can reach its maximal potential within the system. If we are too scared to be adopting the technology, if we do not resolve the technical issues, if we do not take a strategic approach to AI, then we can fall behind. Just to finish off, we want to allude to that second point. There's not as much detail here as what we've had in terms of the benefits to the classroom, but in terms of the preparation for the skill sets upon which we're preparing students for the wider world. I just want a quote here from Norbert Wiener, famous mathematician from University, MIT. If we were to use, to achieve our purposes, a mechanical agency, in this case, artificial intelligence, with whose operation we cannot interfere effectively, we'd better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire. And I think this notion in itself is something that as leaders of education for the future, we need to take seriously, because if we just allow AI to supplant and come into education without that strategic vision, without that strategic discussion, then we could become almost domesticated by the artificial intelligence itself, and we are then become the product. And that then brings into the ethical implications that may result from the adoption of artificial intelligence. And we would talk about these explicit ethical implications in terms of privacy and intellectual property concerns. Who will own all of this data that's being processed? Who can use it? And who is ultimately accountable? Is it the classroom teacher? Is it the parents? Is it the senior leadership team, the trust leadership team? Is it those big AI companies that produce the software that would be possibly used in schools? I mean, there are attempts at the moment currently to look at the ethical implementation of AI in education. The Institute for Ethical Implementation of AI in Education, it does exist. But again, we would question as to who is setting this ethical guidance. And when you look into the reports that have been produced, it is Microsoft, it is Pearson, these big players on the global stage when it comes to education and when it comes to technology. And we would question, who are they to decide as to what is ethical or not ethical about the artificial intelligence that is being implemented inside of schools? If they're the ones giving the guidance, surely there must be research, or at least some critique as to what their ethics are as a company. But also, you know, AI could be open to manipulation by hackers, erroneous algorithms, etc. Just imagine, I know this was alluded to earlier, you have students that are far more capable at computer science and the exploration of the digital world than their teachers. Who's to say that those students could not hack into the system and manipulate those algorithms to favor results in a certain particular area? But of course, we also have the potential biases, the inherent discrimination, which may transfer from the individual teacher or those big companies designing the AI, that will transfer into the new tech, which may breed a new age of systemic discrimination in which future generations would have to contend with. And that's, you know, these are strategic points that we must consider. And one final note, just for us as leaders to consider, is that we just don't know what the future will look like. You know, change is the only certainty. Discontinuity is reliable. You know, where the world that we live in, you know, where it is formed of profound change, you know, profound change isn't the product, but it becomes the norm. And I think there needs to be a wider discussion concerning the purpose of education. Multiple teachers will stipulate that the purpose of education is to prepare our students for the world in which they're going to grow into. But we as adults do not know what that world looks like. And I think the sooner that educationalists and strategic leaders take that notion on board and start considering education and thinking about the wider goals of education and preparing young people for this fluctuating world, the better service we will be delivering to our core stakeholder, which is those young people that we serve. And I think, you know, that is our presentation on artificial intelligence. So I'm going to pass back over to you, Trevor.
Thank you, Mark. That was really, really very interesting. I really